Hello, I'm Nicole
Hello.
Balial of Global Justice Journal. Joining me today is Reverend Dr. Gary Mason, who played an integral role in the Irish peace process and who now leads Rethinking Conflict, an organization that works to resolve conflict on a global level. Thanks so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us today, Dr. Mason.
Okay. Thank you. It's nice to join you, and I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you so much. So, without taking much of your time, going right ahead with the few questions that we have. Uh, for those of us who are young to remember the Irish Troubles, can you please tell our viewers a bit about the causes of the conflict in Northern Ireland and how the conflict was manifested?
Okay. Yeah. I mean, literally, we could spend 1 hour, much longer, just in that question. Depending where you want to start, Nicole, we could go back to the 11th or 12th century. We could go back to the 16th or 17th century. I often say invariably conflict involves three items: land, identity, and religion. And all those three components, to a greater or lesser degree, were evident in the Irish conflict. Looking back to the 16th and 17th century, that probably set the template for what happened in the 20th century and spilled into the 21st century. But the period I lived through, I mean, putting it very simply, I guess, within the northern part of Ireland, or Northern Ireland, in the mid 50s and 60s, there was probably a 2/3 British Unionist Protestant majority. So, very simply put, their political nationalistic allegiance was to London or to the United Kingdom. There was about a third who saw themselves as Irish Catholic nationalist, and generally their preference was that the island never should have been partitioned in 1921. That when the War of Independence was over between the British and the Irish, all the island should have reverted under Irish control and a government in Dublin. That didn't happen because in 1921, Northern Ireland was born, 6 counties out of 32 Irish counties, and primarily there was a 2/3 Protestant majority. Late 1960s, that's when the conflict that is called the Troubles, and I often kind of say, Nicole, I mean, it's typical Irish understatement. The Troubles. I mean, in reality, it was an internal civil war. Tiny, tiny space, Northern Ireland. You're interviewing me from India with 1 billion+ people living in your subcontinent. During the conflict, with 1.6 million people. That's all. It's like a tiny city nearly in India. But over that 30-year period, in that small population, we had 47,000 injuries, 36,000 shootings, 22,000 armed robberies, 30,000 people went through our penal system, 16,000 bombings, and almost 4,000 deaths. I often extrapolate those figures, particularly when I'm speaking in the United States, and put it very simply and say, if the Irish conflict had happened in the United States, with your population over a 30-year period, in the United States, you would have had 700,000 dead, 6 million political prisoners, 9 million injuries, 7 million shootings, and 3 million bombings. So as I talk to you today, if you were to say to me, Gary, what is the biggest issue today post-conflict? It's dealing with the legacy of the conflict. It was interestingly, George Mitchell was the American Democratic senator who chaired the talks leading up to our peace agreement, the Good Friday Agreement, which was signed on April the 10th, 1998. Interestingly said, if you think getting this agreement was difficult, and it was, implementing it will be even more difficult. So as I'm talking to you thousands of miles away in India, we are still, 23 years later, implementing that peace agreement.
Thank you, Dr. Mason. Moving on to my next question. You're known for having been integral to the Irish peace process and have received many well-deserved honors for your role in ending the armed conflict. How did you become involved in the process, and what do you consider to be the key factors in your success?
I often say to Nicole, reconciliation, to quote a South African professor, is no cheap matter. It does not come about by simply papering over deep-seated differences. He suggests reconciliation presupposes confrontation. I think I'd maybe want to add in there managed confrontation. But he suggests without that, you do not get reconciliation, but merely a kind of temporary glossing over of differences. I mean, the running sores of society cannot be healed with the use of a sticking plaster or a band-aid. I mean, reconciliation presupposes an operation, a kind of cutting to the very bone without anesthetic. Because in any conflicted zone, I mean, the infection is not just on the surface. And as he suggested in the South African context, I mean, the abscess of hatred, mistrust and fear between black and white, nation and nation, rich and poor, has to be sliced open. In my context, I guess, as a religious leader and also working in academia, I was open to any conversations that were necessary. I mean, I do a lot of work at the moment around the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is not similar to Cameroon. It's not similar to the Irish conflict. But I often suggest, be it Cameroon, be it the Balkans, be it even the divisions in the United States at the moment, there are lessons from any peace process that can be applicable to other zones. So for example, when I have Israelis and Palestinians in my space in Belfast, some of the lessons they tell me are undoubtedly applicable to Cameroon. The first one they say is that political leadership is essential to achieving peace. So I've never been to Cameroon, but even an outsider looking in, and in the few papers I've read, literally just in recent days, I would be saying that leaders on all sides of the conflict must sincerely believe that change is preferable to the status quo, and then be willing to take the risks to achieve peace, but also, and this is also key, providing the vision that ensures they maintain the grassroots support of their supporters. Interestingly, here in the early 1990s, we had what we called a mutually hurting stalemate, which just simply meant that all sides were hurting. There was a total log jam. And really what began to develop then within both sides was a desire to break the cycle of violence, to save future generations from the horrors of conflict. That emerged in both the nationalist, the unionist communities, and that played an important role in creating an environment for peace. And that desire for a better future encouraged leaders on both sides to take risks, face down accusations of betrayal from within their own communities to achieve peace. I've never been in Cameroon, but if I was a parent, a grandparent, a business person, an academic, this conflict that I don't know a lot about, but human nature and experience tells me, unless leaders on both sides take the risk to achieve peace, when I'm probably long dead and you're a little bit older, the conflict will still be there. Conflicts do not resolve themselves through some magical dust or instantaneously. It takes hard work. People often say to me, Nicole, be it Israelis, Palestinians, or any region I deal in, they say, Gary, you don't understand. And I say, tell me, what do I not understand? They say there's no trust. And I remind them, listen, when I first began negotiations with people who were involved in political violence, be that in the IRA, on the pro-nationalist Irish side, or on the pro-British side, there are militia groups. I said, do you really think those first meetings were all hugs and kisses? They were toxic. And I was saying a lack of trust between opposing sides is actually an inevitable feature of building peace, but it cannot be used as a justification for not beginning the process. And the little I look at Cameroon from the outside looking in, I'm assuming in too many people's minds, political leaders, academic leaders, religious leaders, they are using a lack of trust as an excuse for not taking the strategic, thoughtful risks to begin a conversation. So trust doesn't come at the start of a process. Trust evolves through dialogue, sometimes secret dialogue, by meeting commitments and by building confidence through concrete actions. Another interesting phenomenon as I look at some of the bloodshed in Cameroon as a person who's very new to this conflict, but looking at my space, looking at the Middle East, in which I've worked extensively in the last 11 years. People often say to me, security, 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 and I am not naive enough to know that security is not important. If you get on a flight out of India, or I get on a flight out of the UK or Ireland, I want to go through airport security because I really do not want my flesh shredded at 35,000 feet over the Pacific or the Atlantic. So we need security. But I would suggest this, that attempts to resolve a conflict through military force were ultimately futile. They did not result in sustainable security for either community. So not dissimilar to Cameroon, with a cycle of violence, where each side seeks to hurt the other side as much as that side hurts you. When did we achieve security? When dialogue was prioritized, when the actual root causes of the conflict were addressed by the establishment of new frameworks, political institutions that gave space for each of those divided communities to pursue their visions through politics, not through political violence. The other key concept I want to underline that's absolutely crucial is the role of civic society and grassroots organizations. We need politicians, but if politicians dominate what I call the public space, the peace process can be lopsided. We also need women at the table. I mean, research shows where women are at the table, there is a much better chance of the peace process succeeding. And as a good colleague of mine, a leading sociologist globally, says that the negotiated settlement is never the end for peacemaking. We need a social peace process that includes truth and reconciliation processes, forgiveness and atonement processes. The public space cannot just be dominated by politicians. So I think those 5 ingredients are crucial for Cameroon.
So you have also frequently spoken about the hard work of peace. In the 23 years since the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, what hard work has been needed to sustain peace in Northern Ireland?
Yeah. And really, Nicole, that builds very naturally on my last point and my last answer. From 2017, January 2017 to January 2020, we had no functioning government. Because of toxic politics and toxic relationships, our government just imploded. No government for 3 years. People often used to say to me, hey, Gary, why have you not gone back to violence? And one of the things I've said, and there's a multiplicity of reasons, but one of the key reasons is the role of civic society in building peace. And I simply put it like this, that civic society, if it's functioning correctly, should actually be the social glue that holds a peace process together. And so people listening to this may ask, particularly people who hold the power strings, they say, well, tell me, why should civil society have any participation at all in a peace process? Peace processes, as we all know, are processes of political decision-making. But we need to hold our politicians accountable for building peace, but also participation as well. I mean, it's a fundamental human right. And if people at grassroots level are involved in these processes, to my mind, it gives it more legitimacy. Because peace processes are not just to do with politicians or even militia groups. They've got to include NGOs, academics, women's groups, etc., etc. And to allow ownership of a peace agreement, the more people from civic society, the more you have a wide range of actors, the more there is a chance of that being sustained. So one of the key components to our peace process has been the role of civic society. It's been absolutely crucial. I mean, the Good Friday Agreement, it's not utopia. And it's interesting when I have different people in this space from across the globe, in a strange way of not being utopia is comforting to them. If I brought them into some space where there was no walls, no separation, it looked like a kind of mini form of paradise, people would say this is completely unrealistic. But I know when I have Israelis and Palestinians in this space, we still have our security cameras, we still have our segregation, we still have high barriers. But primarily, most people are realizing that politics has to work, democracy has to work, civic society has to work. And so people from the Middle East say to me, yeah, it's not utopia, but I would give my right arm to have what you have after our many failed attempts at trying to build peace in our region.
So how has Brexit impacted this work?
Yeah, there will be a few PhD theses of your generation will be written on Brexit, to put it mildly. So I'm quite happy to put my cards on the table. I was a Remainer. I voted against Brexit. I don't think it's a good idea. And interestingly, in my space, the key to the Good Friday Agreement in many, many ways was it softened identity. Many people within the nationalist, Catholic, Irish community saw this place as incredibly distinctively British. They felt my identity is not understood, it's not recognized. The Good Friday Agreement allowed people to designate as British, Irish, Northern Irish, or none of those. So it tried to remove that concept of toxic identity politics out of that space. The problem with Brexit is it has sharpened identity politics. It has made it stronger. And people actually ignore identity politics at their peril. I mean, as you kind of look at two sort of words, interest and identity. So many people in the West would say, well, we're people of interest. We want to live in a liberal democracy. We want to live in a market economy. The difficulty is some agreements, some political solutions move identity up to such a space where it becomes divisive. The United States is a typical example where identity politics in the last 6 or 7 years in the United States has created immense polarization. And so for many people here whose Irishness was recognized, they felt that Irishness has been diminished under the Good Friday Agreement. And I often say, in any situation, no matter where you're living, good government, good policies, good democracies look after your minorities. I mean, the recent round of violence in the Middle East, I mean, primarily look at that Israeli-Palestinian theater. This just wasn't about the West Bank, Palestine and Gaza. There was violence internally in Israel between Jew and Arab. And in some of the conversations I've had there in recent weeks, I've said, sadly, welcome to Northern Ireland. This is neighbor killing neighbor. When that begins to happen, it is much more difficult to bring to an end. We had people living in one street, killing people in the next street. This is up close and personal. This is in your face bloodshed. It's very, very difficult to contain. We need to look after our minorities. We need to ensure they feel they have a role in the space. Because if they don't, I mean, I want people to choose non-violent protest. I don't want people to choose violence. But the irony is, if people's backs are so against the wall, much as I may disagree as a religious leader, we leave the space open for people to choose political violence. And dealing with the role of that and the memory of that as it's passed seamlessly from generation to generation can take generations. So as I look as an outsider looking at Cameroon and looking at the difficulties there, stretching back 100 years plus with what has happened after the First World War and undoubtedly before, the longer this goes on, the more the pain psychologically and politically is passed from generation to generation to generation. And I often illustrate it like this with an illustration that was in a book to do with the Balkans that broke up in the early 1990s. And the American journalist tells a story that he's standing in a room with a group of Serbian nationals. He leaves the room, someone runs out after him, places a piece of paper in his hand, he opens it up, some obscure date from the 15th century is on this, like the Battle of Constantinople, the Battle of Kosovo. He says, what is this? He says, the Battle of Kosovo, which the Serbs lost. But a Serbian nationalist said this: you take away the Battle of Kosovo, you take away the soul of the Serbian nation. 600 years later, 600 years, in the early 1990s, Serbian nationals, because of the power of memory and the stories passed from generation, used the loss of some of those battles as justification for the genocide of 10,000 Bosnian Muslims. 600 years. So does Cameroon want to pass the stories from generation to generation to generation? So no matter what side of the fence you're on, is this your gift to your children, your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren, your great-great-great-grandchildren? I hope not.
How can the lessons learned in Northern Ireland be applied to the Anglophone crisis in Cameroon?
People, I mean, in reading around this, I know there's political violence rising up within that community, and the hope that that may change the situation of the demographics in relation to that. I've been wanting to broaden that and ask, are there key religious leaders? Are there women's leaders, there are academics that are willing to reach out to the other side and begin some of those uncomfortable conversations? The role of the international community. I mean, being honest, British Irish in this space, probably we're not going to resolve the internal difficulties. We needed the help of the European Union. We needed the help of key actors in Australia, Canada, the United States. We needed people like Bill Clinton to take political risks to get people over the line. So I think those are some of the key lessons. I mean, I would want to be asking, if I was a strategist in Cameroon, a peace builder, a political strategist wanting to resolve this, be it through the United Nations or through the EU or the Arab League, people need to be lobbying those spaces to raise more international interests within it. What is the role of Germany? What is the role of Great Britain? What is the role of France? Because as much as they may try to kind of extradite themselves from that situation, the sad history of colonialism in planet Earth is that the fingerprints many, many times of white Europeans like me are all over these spaces. And we can't turn around and say, it's no longer our responsibility. We created a context to allow conflict to happen. We need to have the integrity, the morality, and the courage to say, there's actually some unfinished business here that we need to try to resolve. So is it putting some of those key leaders out? Is it quiet conversations? Listen, this is not an overnight phenomenon. I can't press a fast forward button today and move this forward. This could be a 5 to 10 year process, but I would suggest it may be better beginning it in 2021 rather than waiting 5 years and beginning it in 2026. when there's more widows, widowers, children with no parents, parents with no children, etc., etc., etc. And if they leave another 5 years, the scars are deeper than what they are in 2021. You have more bloodshed, you have more memory, you have more toxicity, both religiously, sociologically, and politically.
What do you perceive to be the greatest threats to a peaceful resolution of the Anglophone crisis? And how would you suggest those threats be mitigated?
Yeah. I think you're going to need courageous leadership within that community. Courageous leadership also within those who see themselves as more from the French concept. But the international community, as I alluded to earlier, there needs to be looking at this and trying to map out certain ways. I mean, I know the United Nations is in that space trying to resolve it, but how do you bring this up to a higher international framework? What is the role of your organization in political lobbying and funding, etc., etc.? It's interesting, one of the keys to the Irish peace process was pretty serious financial investment from the European Union and also from the United States. I mean, I spearheaded it, as you know, Nick, on that Skenos project. That was a kind of $30 million. I describe it really as a post-conflict shared space urban village. And it was about economic peace building, but it was also about political peace building. It was also about civic society peace building. Economics alone will not resolve the Cameroon situation any more than politics alone. So you need several strands spilling through that. You need people to realize there's an investment in investing their lives in what could be a very difficult process and a long process. But the investment, like we had $1 billion from the United States, the International Fund for Ireland, with €1 billion from Europe. And in many ways, that money, I've often described it in the 1990s, it kind of broke up to a degree the sort of hardened soil of sectarianism, allowed people who saw themselves as enemies to humanize the other person. It wasn't an overnight phenomenon, but at least it began the architecture or the building blocks of what could be possible.
What do you perceive to be the greatest opportunities for a peaceful resolution to the Anglophone crisis? And how do you think those opportunities can be leveraged?
Yeah, and that's what I'm saying. I mean, there has to be, does there need to be economic sanctions? Does there need to be outside pressure? I mean, people who are involved in political violence or involved in dictatorship don't change naturally. There needs to be some benefit, some process that actually allows this to happen. So I think, and I mean, as well, it could be the possibility of getting some of those key actors out of your space, bringing them to other spaces like the Irish conflict, and spending a week at least learning some of the lessons, not necessarily as saying this is how you have to do it. I mean, I often describe when people are in my space looking at some of the lessons, I would say, look, this is like a football game. You're spectators watching the players on the field. And you may see, well, that person didn't pass the ball too well. How did they miss that goal? But at least it allows you to have a healthy critique of what could be possible in your space. It's not up to white Europeans to tell people how to resolve this, but I think it's up to people within the global community to at least create the context or the conditions to allow the space to learn lessons that could be possible for the future and allow people in Cameroon to begin to shape this process. I mean, if they don't, I mean, even a cursory glance at history, as I alluded to earlier, shows this is not going away. So either people begin to do the hard work of building peace, or in 10 years' time, people will still be having these conversations in probably a much more profoundly different atmosphere.
One important distinction between the troubles of Northern Ireland and the Anglophone crisis is the President of Cameroon has consistently ranked as one of the world's top dictators. In fact, in 2018, US Ambassador Barlane condemned the government for the targeted killings of Anglophone citizens. In this light, what role would you see foreign governments playing in peace building efforts?
Yeah. And as you're saying there, I mean, obviously the US ambassador has said that America's incredibly strong voice, as we know, on planet Earth, but the United Nations needs to be coming out and condemning this. I mean, other countries, the EU needs to be coming out and condemning this. So it needs to be a more global impact, and that'll only come about through political strategy, through about political lobbying, through about key meetings, trying to get key people around a table who are strategic people who can influence this space in a much wider context. What are other African nations? What are your neighbours saying in relation to that? What is the role for people who share the continent of Africa? Because the continent of Africa is going to boom. To have a number of contested spaces scattered over that continent is never going to allow Africa as a continent to flourish and achieve the immense potential it actually has.
Another important distinction between Northern Ireland and Cameroon is the government's approach to the civilization of
Yeah.
ex-combatants. Whereas numerous atrocities have been documented in Cameroon's DDR centers, you have spearheaded a more humane approach in Northern Ireland. Can you tell us about your methodology and how it might fit into the Cameroon framework?
Yeah. These are very painful things to talk about because, in a human scale, dealing with people who, to put it bluntly, have a hell of a lot of blood in their hands is never easy. The irony is, you cannot end political violence without talking to those who were pursuing political violence. So, I mean, I'm condemning, call it terrorism, call it freedom fighters, call it militia groups. To me, as a religious leader, it's fundamentally wrong. But it's not enough just to say that. I have to ask myself the question, why did these people choose political violence in the first place, much as I disagree with that choice? Look at the Northern Ireland context, or the North of Ireland context. We had 30,000, primarily men, of my generation and younger and older, went to prison. So someone once said here who did go to prison, someone in the late 1960s did not fly over Northern Ireland, spray us all with lunatic gas, and we all woke up one day and said, let's start killing each other. People don't do that naturally. There's a context that allows people to do dreadful things. Sociologists tell me that those 30,000 people who went to prison here, if they had been born in Bombay, Moscow, Paris, Vancouver, Atlanta, 90% of them never would have been in prison. 10% would have been. Society's psychopaths that we all have, who like killing and enjoy killing. So what made that 90% make, to me, what were wrong choices? But it's not enough if you're going to approach this in an intelligent manner. Why did they do that? There was a context of land, identity, toxic politics, toxic religion, theologies of superiority. My religious system is superior to your religious system. My politics are superior to your politics. And sadly, many young men, and to a lesser degree women, in their teens, made choices that still affect them to this day. I don't necessarily agree with those choices. I regret the choices, and many of them regret the choices. But the irony is, it has to be said categorically that there were conditions that allowed people to choose conflict and to be involved in some dreadful acts of violence. We can't ignore that.
One of the current regime's greatest strengths is the divisiveness that currently exists between various opposition groups, most notably between federalists and those who support the secession of the Anglophone regions. What is your message to these groups?
Like I was saying very, very simply, in any relationship, let's move away from politics at the moment. In any relationship, to my mind, I'm married, I have 4 children. If I am abusive to my wife or my kids, physically, emotionally, it's going to leave a legacy. So in other words, if I want to dominate my children or dominate my wife, dominate my partner, there's consequences to that. Peace processes are really not that different. The Good Friday Agreement tried to create a win-win situation for all sides. So as I look at, be it the Federalists or the secessionists or those who are pursuing the Francophile concept, if you work on the assumption that your way is the only way, be that in relationships, be that in land, be that in politics, eventually that will come back to haunt you. Relationships succeed when everyone feels they have a place at the table. And one of the key components of the Good Friday Agreement was it created a win-win situation for all sides. It didn't humiliate any person. There's a great article that maybe some of your readers may want to Google, written by a guy in the United States, entitled "Humiliation is the Root of All Terrorism." Maybe I would soften or change the title and say humiliation is one of the main roots of terrorism. So to all your listeners, think about a time you felt humiliated, demeaned, downtrodden. What do you want to do? Be honest. Many times you wanted to even the score, get revenge, lick your lips assuming my day will come when I will balance the scales. Is that the future you want for Cameroon? Or are there some flexible structures you would be willing to give? Not every structure, but some structures to create a space for your children, your children's children to prosper economically, educationally, emotionally, physically, spiritually, mentally. Does that not sound like a better deal than having these conversations when many people listening to what I'm saying today are dead? Do you really want to be lying on your deathbed, breathing your last breath, wondering, what does the future hold for this country, for my children and my children's children? As a religious leader, let me say categorically, that is not a good way to die.
So, Dr. Mason, finally, if asked, would you be willing to offer your expertise to help bring peace to Cameroon?
Yeah. Yes, I'm more than happy to help, and I would never, I don't want to describe myself as an expert. I'm just a human being on this planet who's a religious leader, community leader, lived through 30 years of bloodshed that I know could have been averted with good religious leadership, good political leadership, but we allowed voices at times to inhabit the public space, loud, booming voices, both politically and religiously, who assured their followers that my way was the only way. 30 years after killing each other, we slowly and painfully began to realize, are there other ways? And categorically, there are other ways. And if there's any way I can help fellow human beings living in a very different space that I have grown up, I'm more than happy to do that.
Thank you, Dr. Mason. Thank you so much for taking out the time to talk to us today. It was wonderful speaking with you.
Okay. And I just wish you, organization, and my fellow human beings in Cameroon who share this tiny ball in the middle of a vast solar system well in trying to achieve, for the few years we have on this planet, some form of meaningful, purposeful existence. So my best wishes and prayers will be with you.
Thank you, Dr. Mason.
Okay, thank you. Good day.
Good day.